10 avoidable mistakes people make when betting on big sporting events. Steering. Clear of these common sports, betting mistakes could mean the difference between winning or losing big. Sports betting is legal or in the process of becoming legal in 40 states, and the District of Columbia, although betting on big sports events could be a way to get a little extra cash now and then, it could also lead to a depleted savings account and should never be used as a way to get out of debt. Betting on the popular sporting event instead of betting on the Super Bowl may be exciting, but is football really what you know best? A long-term, profitable betting strategy hinges on your historical and current knowledge of teams, individual players, and the sport. If you're an avid baseball, soccer, or even Russian table tennis fan with loads of information under your belt, start there instead, making it too complicated. Don't be afraid to make a simple money line bet, which is just choosing whether or not a team will win, rather than something like a parlay, where you combine multiple bets into one wager. Making things complicated in the beginning before you know the ins and outs of sports betting could be a frustrating experience and might deter you from learning everything you want to know. Not setting a budget. Setting a budget and sticking to it keeps you from placing more bets in an attempt to recoup losses and helps you bet responsibly without taking on gambling debt or forming a habit. Before you get started, decide how much money you can afford to lose. This is called your bankroll. Many sports betting strategists recommend making bets with only 1% to 5% of your bankroll. You'll also want to keep track of your wagers, wins, and losses using a simple spreadsheet. Some sportsbooks, the company or individual that can legally take your bet, offer additional tools to help you track your be relying on emotion instead of data. This may seem obvious, but emotional betting, fueled by things like childhood attachments or even a compelling underdog story in the news, is so common that there's even a name for it: sentiment bias. Just because you had a Pittsburgh Steelers raincoat when you were a kid doesn't mean you always have to bet on them to win. Betting in favor of popular home teams. Another form of sentiment bias is when fans bet on their favorite home team. With hugely popular teams, sportsbooks often shade the line, giving the favored team slightly higher odds instead of opening the bet with true odds. This means that if you bet on the favored team and they win, your return will be less than what it would be if the sportsbook had opened with the true odds, not taking injuries into consideration. Stay abreast of anything that could affect a team's game day performance, like injuries or weather, that could cause a sportsbook to change the odds between the time the bet opens to the time the game starts. For instance, if a popular athlete is injured, that's a big deal because of his popularity and following. As a result, it will likely cause the odds to change. However, if two team starters come down with the flu but are still playing, that might not change the odds. Being swayed by a team or player's recent wins. Recency bias is when investors place more importance on recent events than long-term patterns. For sports bettors, this could mean ignoring historical or seasonal data in favor of a belief that based on a team's recent wins, they're going to win. Instead, look at the long-term stats that make the most sense for the sport, whether that's a few years back or just the current season. Ignoring teams on a losing streak. Teams on a losing streak are typically undervalued, as recreational bettors tend to bet with recency bias, but take a look at the team's historical data. Have they performed well otherwise this season? If so, you could have found a good opportunity for an upcoming win. Believing that the gambler's fallacy is not a fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is the belief that after a series of losses, either the team or the bettor are statistically or energetically due for a win. Unfortunately, just as a roulette wheel is never due a color or number, a team is never due a win. Nor do the odds increase in best 2 out of 3 playoff or series situations. In short, consider the odds for each individual game rather than the series as a whole, focusing on your wins and losses rather than total value. Not all wagers have the same payout. In your long-term strategy, you want to focus on total value rather than the number of wins or losses. You could have an entire month of wins but still not make as much money as someone who had a few losses. It all depends on the odds. Look for small edges in the bet where you can exploit the potential value and focus on the total value won or lost over a longer period. Bottom line, there's no doubt that betting can be fun and exciting. However, gambling is not on our list of the best side hustles and shouldn't be used as a reliable way to make more income. By learning to avoid these betting mistakes, you can keep betting on sports fun and not worry about breaking the bank. Betting on sports you aren't familiar with. Bettors should stick with the sports where their knowledge base is the strongest. Just because everyone in your office is all about football doesn't mean that you should be putting money down on some Sunday action if you don't really know or love the game. You make it that much harder for yourself to actually win anything if you jump into wagering on a sport you don't know fairly intimately. You can best understand odds, handicaps, and more if you are comfortable with how the sport is played and how different teams within that sport tend to fare. Placing a bet on any random sport just for the sake of it means you're pretty much bound to fail. Don't do it. Misunderstanding value. Plenty of bettors wager on whichever outcome they think is most likely to happen. This seems like that's what you're supposed to do, but of course it's all a bit more complicated than that. You have to look at value to really improve your chances of making an actual profit. Value isn't the same as odds. Rather, value measures how the odds relate to the estimated chances of your wager winning. You should bet only when the probability of the outcome is higher than the implied probability. You can always calculate the implied probability of an outcome by looking at the betting odds from the bookmaker. Whether the odds are presented as fractional, decimal, or moneyline odds, you can determine the implied probability, as a percentage value is always thought of as positive or negative. A wager has a positive value if the chances of winning are greater than the implied probability that's reflected in the odds. Meanwhile, a wager has negative value if it's less likely to win than the implied probability suggests. To make money, you have to find bets with positive value. Let's say that the Iowa State Cyclones are going to be up against the Georgia Bulldogs in football. You can check each team's standings and you see that Iowa State is ranked first in the Big 12 with a 5-2 standing, while Georgia is second in the SEC East with a 4-2 standing. The two teams are pretty evenly matched, but Iowa State has a small advantage. With some more research, you give Iowa State a 55% chance of winning and Georgia a 45% chance of winning. Then you look at your favorite betting site and they offer these odds: Iowa State 173, Georgia 210. From these numbers, we can quickly calculate the implied probabilities. Iowa State 1173, x 100 for 578%. Georgia 1210, x 100 for 47, 6%. Then we compare the probabilities we gave to the outcomes versus the implied probabilities. Team probability, implied probability. Iowa State 55%, 578%. Georgia 45%, 476%.